Chapter 47. Deaths and Marriages. One of the immediate acts of the Prophet on his return from Badr had been to visit the grave of his daughter Ruqayya, and Fatirnah went with him. This was the first bereavement they had suffered within their closest family circle since the death of Khadija, and Fatima was greatly distressed by the loss of her sister. The tears poured from her eyes as she sat beside her father at the edge of the grave, and he comforted her and sought to dry her tears with the corner of his cloak. He had previously spoken against lamentations for the dead, but this had led to a misunderstanding, and when they returned from the cemetery, the voice of Urnar was heard raised in anger against the women who were weeping for the martyrs of Badr and for Ruqayya. "Umar, let them weep," he said. And then he added, "What comes from the heart and from the eye, that is from God and his mercy, but what comes from the hand and from the tongue, that is from Satan." By the hand he meant the beating of the breast and the lacerating of the cheeks, and by the tongue he meant the vociferous clamour in which all the women joined as a social gesture. Fatirnah was the youngest of his daughters, and she was at this time about 20 years old. To his family he had already spoken of Ali as the most fitting husband for her, but there had been no formal contract. Abu Bakr and Umar had both asked for her hand, but the Prophet had put them off, not by saying that she was already promised to another, but by telling them that he must wait for the time appointed by heaven. It was only in the weeks which followed his return from Badr that he became certain that the time had come, and he then spoke words of encouragement to Ali in the wish that he should formally ask for her hand. All was at first hesitant on account of his extreme poverty. He had inherited nothing from his father, for the law of the new religion forbade a believer to inherit from a disbeliever. But he had acquired a humble dwelling not far from the mosque, and, since there was no doubt about the Prophet's wishes, he allowed himself to be persuaded. After the formal contract had been made, the Prophet insisted on a wedding feast. A ram was sacrificed, and some of the helpers brought offerings of grain. Abu Salama, cousin to both bridegroom and bride, was anxious to help, the more so since he owed so much to Ali's father, who had given him protection against Abu Jahl and other hostile members of his clan. So Salama went together with Aisha to make ready the house for the bridal couple and to prepare the food. Soft sand was brought from the riverbed, and they scattered it over the earthen floor of the house. The bridal bed was a sheepskin, and there was a faded coverlet of striped cloth from the Yemen. For a pillow, they stuffed a leather cushion with palm fibre. Then they laid out dates and figs for the guests to eat in addition to the main meal, and they filled the waterskin with water that they had perfumed. It was generally agreed that this wedding feast was one of the finest held in Medina at this time. When the Prophet withdrew, as a sign for the guests to leave the bridal pair alone together, he told Ali not to approach his wife until he himself returned, which he did shortly after the last guest had departed. Ayman was still there, helping to set the house in order after the celebrations. The Prophet had many special relationships in his life, which were not shared by any except himself and the person in question. One of these was with Irnan. When he asked permission to enter, it was she who now came to the entrance. "Where is my brother?" he said. "My father and my mother be thy ransom, O Messenger of God," she said. "Who is your brother?" "Abu Talib's son, Ali," he said. "How can he be your brother?" she said, "when you have even now married your daughter to him?" "He is what I said," replied the Prophet, and asked her to bring him some water, which she did. Having taken a mouthful and rinsed his mouth, he spat it back into the vessel. Then, when all came, he bade him sit in front of him, and taking some of the water in his hand, he sprinkled it over his shoulders and breast and arms. Then he called Fatima to him, and she came, tripping over her robe in the awe and reverence she had for her father. He did the same to her as to Ali, and invoked blessings upon them both and upon their offspring. In the year which followed the return from Badr, the family of Umar suffered two losses. The first of these was the death of his son-in-law Kunais, the husband of his daughter Hafsa. He had been one of the emigrants to Abyssinia, and it was on his return that the marriage had taken place. Hafsa was only 18 years old when she became a widow. She was both beautiful and accomplished, having learned like her father to read and write, and seeing that the death of Ruqayya had left Uthman so disconsolate, Umar offered him Hafsa in marriage. Uthman said that he would think about it, but after some days he came to Umar and said he thought it was better that he should not marry again for the moment. Umar was very disappointed and also somewhat hurt by Uthman's refusal. But he was determined to find a good husband for his daughter, so he went to Abu Bakr, whom he counted as his best friend, and proposed the match to him. Abu Bakr answered him evasively, which hurt Umar's feelings even more than Uthman's definite refusal, though at the same time it was more understandable, for Abu Bakr already had one wife to whom he was deeply attached, whereas Uthman was now single. Perhaps he could be made to change his mind, and the next time Umar was with the Prophet, he gave vent to his grievance. "Behold," said the Prophet, "I will show you a better son-in-law than Uthman, and I will show him a better father-in-law than you." "So be it," said Umar with a smile of happiness when, after a moment's reflection, he divined that the better man referred to in both cases was none other than the Prophet, who would himself take Hafsa to wife, and who would become, for the second time, the father-in-law of Uthman by giving him in marriage Ruqayya's sister, Kulthum. It was after this that Abu Bakr explained the reason for his silence to Umar, namely that the Prophet had confided to him, as a secret not yet to be divulged, his intention to ask for the hand of Hafsa. The marriage of Kulthum and Uthman took place first, and when the legally necessary 4 months had elapsed since the death of Kunais, and when an apartment had been added to those of Sauda and Aisha adjoining the mosque, the Prophet's own marriage was celebrated. A little less than a year after the Battle of Badr, the arrival of Hafsa did not mar the harmony of the household. Aisha was pleased to have a companion nearer to her own age, and a lasting friendship was soon developed between the two younger wives, while Sauda, who had been something of a mother to Aisha, now extended a share of her maternal benevolence to the newcomer, who was nearly 20 years younger than herself. It was about the time of this marriage that Umar's brother-in-law died, Hafsa's maternal uncle, Uthman ibn Maz'un. Both he and his wife Khawla had always been very close to the Prophet, and Uthman was the most ascetic of his companions. He had been an ascetic before the revelation of Islam, and since his emigration to Medina, he had become so bent on suppressing earthly desires that he asked permission of the Prophet to make himself a eunuch and to spend the rest of his life as a wandering beggar. "Hast thou not in me a fair example?" said the Prophet, "and I go into women, and I eat meat, and I fast, and I break my fast. He is not of my people who maketh men eunuchs, or maketh himself a eunuch." But the Prophet had reason to think that Uthman had not fully understood him, so on another occasion he put the same question, "Have you not in me an example?" Uthman fervently assented, then asked what was amiss. "Thou fastest every day," said the Prophet, "and keepest vigil every night in prayer." "Yea, that indeed I do," said Uthman, for he had heard him speak again and again of the merits of fasting and of night prayer. "Do not so," said the Prophet, "for verily your eyes have their rights over you, and your body has its rights, and your family have their rights. So pray, and sleep, and fast, and break fast." As an expression of the primordial religion, the revelation continually stressed the importance of giving thanks to God for all the most elementary blessings of life. He has given you hearing and sight and heart knowledge that you may be thankful, and one of his signs is that he created for you spouses from among yourselves so that you may find comfort in them, and he has placed between you compassion and mercy. Surely in this are signs for people who reflect. Ask them, O Prophet, imagine if Allah were to make the night perpetual for you until the day of judgment, which God other than Allah could bring you sunlight. Will you not then listen? Ask them also, imagine if Allah were to make the day perpetual for you until the day of judgment, which God other than Allah could bring you night to rest in. Will you not then see? It is out of his mercy that he has made for you the day and night, so that you may rest in the latter and seek his bounty in the former, and perhaps you will be grateful. For primordial man, the natural enjoyments, consecrated by thankfulness to God, are modes of worship. And with reference to himself, the Prophet spoke of the pleasures of the senses and of prayer in the same context. It has been given me to love perfume and women, and coolness has been brought to my eyes in the prayer. Immediately after the death of Uthman, before his funeral, the Prophet went with Aisha to visit Khawla, and Aisha said afterwards, "The Prophet kissed Uthman when he was dead, and I saw his tears flowing over Uthman's cheek." At his funeral, the Prophet heard an old woman address the dead man with the words, "Be glad, O father of Sa'ib, for paradise is yours." The Prophet turned to her somewhat sharply and said, "What gives you to know that?" "O Messenger of God," she protested, "it is Abu Sa'ib." "By God," he said, "we know naught but good of him." Then, to make it dear that his first remark had been in no sense directed against Uthman, but merely against her, for saying more than she had right. To say, he turned to her again and added, "It would have been enough for you to say, he loved God and his messenger." Umar confessed to having been somewhat shaken in his high regard for his brother-in-law by the fact that he had not been blessed with a martyr's death. He said, "When Uthman ibn Maz'un died without being slain, he fell immeasurably from my esteem. And I said, Behold this man who was severest of us all, in abstaining from the things of this world, and now he hath died, and was not slain." And so he remained in Umar's opinion until the Prophet and Abu Bakr had both died natural deaths, and he upbraided himself for having lacked a true sense of values, and said to himself, "Out upon thee, the best of us die." He meant die naturally, and Uthman returned in his estimation to the place he had formerly held.